One of the most often claimed proofs for Christianity, indeed for many religious traditions, is the existence of prophecy. Someone long ago predicted the future, and that's how we know they were trustworthy, or at least inspired by some spook in the sky. The problem is that when we really look at these supposed prophecies in detail, they're just not that impressive. Or rather, they're not impressive to the skeptic, who's concerned with whether or not they're factually true. They invariably do impress the true believer, who's only looking for a reason to cling to their faith. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to examine prophecy, the very idea of prophecy, and see what would impress the skeptics, and why what we really see shouldn't impress anyone at all. First off, let's define what we mean when we talk about prophecy. Anyone can make a prophecy. In fact, we see them all the time. Psychics make predictions about the future all the time, and virtually none of them ever come true. But modern psychics like Sylvia Browne used to make predictions and claimed to be between 85 and 90% correct, but studies by the James Randi Educational Foundation found that of her 115 prophetic predictions, she was actually completely correct. Never. Not once. In fact, of those 115 times, she was absolutely wrong in 25 of them, and the rest, her predictions were either too vague to have any meaning, or law enforcement and family members concluded that Browne's predictions were of absolutely no use in solving the crimes. And who could forget the lovable Harold Camping, who repeatedly predicted the end of the world completely wrong and misled a lot of people. In fact, in the past 2,000 years, there have been hundreds and hundreds of failed prophecies for the end times. No matter how many claim to know when the last days are coming, they've always been wrong. And of course, we can't forget about Nostradamus, whose vague quatrains are still believed to be prophetic by many, although they suffer from the same problems that biblical prophecies do. So let's take a look at where all of these things go wrong, shall we? First off, let's look at what a worthwhile prophecy needs to be. It needs to be about more than mundane events. I could prophesy that next Wednesday, the trash I have out at the curb will get picked up. And you know, I'd be right, because that's when they come to empty my trash cans. But that's not impressive. A prophecy needs to be about something which is at least unusual and unlikely to simply happen by chance. A prediction that on a certain date, an earthquake will happen in a general area, that's not that unusual, especially if earthquakes are common in that area. Therefore, if a minor earthquake does happen on that date, we really shouldn't be that impressed. A major earthquake happening under specific conditions on a specific date, that would be a lot more impressive. And that brings us to specificity. Prophecies need to be specific, and this is where almost all of them fail. They don't give any details on what's supposed to happen. Now, it would be very impressive if someone from 500 years ago predicted that on January 20th, 2017, Donald Trump would be inaugurated as President of the United States. That gives specific times, dates, people, and places that a person from 500 years ago could not conceivably have known. I'd be willing to say that that person is a prophet. And that brings us to another thing. The prophecies need to be predictive. You cannot declare something to be prophetic in retrospect. This is where all prophecies fail because they're always looking back, never looking forward. Of course, this is all tied to specificity or lack thereof. Because there's no end date for prophecy, you can never say that a prophecy has failed, only that it hasn't happened yet. Now, of course, if you look at Camping and John Hagee and lunatics like that who do give specific dates, you can say they were wrong. Of course, they'll never admit that. They'll just say they made a bad calculation, and it's not their prophecy, but their date that failed. So they try again, and again, and again. And that's really not impressive either. Then there are the obvious things that I shouldn't have to point out, but that clearly and unfortunately I do. The prophecy must have been demonstrably made significantly before the events that it prophesied. I say that because plenty of so-called prophecies made in the Old Testament were written concurrent with, or even after the events that they supposedly predicted. Prophecies must also have been intended to be prophetic. Again, there are passages in the Old Testament that were ripped out of context and supposed to be prophecies, when there's no evidence that the authors intended them to be. And they have to be accurate. If you predict something is going to happen and only half of it happens, then your prophecy's still a failure. It's all or nothing. After all, we're supposed to think that some all-powerful God is giving this knowledge. I expect some perfection in these prophecies. Sorry. And of course, and this is the biggest element there is, prophecies must be verifiable. It makes no sense to claim that some prophecy came true if you can't objectively demonstrate that it did. I'm not interested in what someone claims happened. I'm interested in what objective evidence proves happened. And unfortunately, when you take these criteria, there simply are no valid or worthwhile prophecies anywhere. They just don't happen. There are tons of prophecies in the Bible that simply don't hold muster. Take, for example, Ezekiel 26:7-14, which a lot of apologists hold up as prophetic. It states that Nebuchadnezzar would sack Tyre to such a degree that it would never be inhabited again. And this simply never happened. The reality is that after a 13-year siege, King Nebuchadnezzar negotiated a compromise with Tyre under which Tyre would accept Nebuchadnezzar's rule without being destroyed. Now, it is true that Tyre was destroyed by Alexander the Great 240 years later, but it has been rebuilt and people live there to this very day. This is not a successful prophecy by any means. Or what about the claim in Ezekiel 29:8-15, which states that Egypt will be desolate and barren and that Egyptians will be scattered among the other nations for 40 years, during which no man or beast will walk the sands of Egypt, and God will own the Nile. Now, that's simply nonsense. There's no archaeological or historical data that suggests that any of this ever happened in reality. Failed prophecy has failed. Ezekiel 30:12 says that the Nile will dry up, which again never happened. Spouting nonsense and believing nonsense doesn't stop it from being nonsense. But let's get to Jesus, since that's what most people want to hear about when we talk about prophecy. Now, as I've said in other videos, the anonymous writers of the Gospels were big on Old Testament prophecy. Matthew, in particular, scoured the Old Testament looking for anything he could use as a prophecy, whether it was intended as such or not, so that he could use it to support his views that Jesus was the Messiah. But there's a lot of supposed prophecies that simply don't hold up to any scrutiny. For instance, Matthew 2:4-6 uses Micah 5:2 to claim that Jesus was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. Except he improperly quotes Micah, which isn't referring to the town of Bethlehem at all, but to the clan of Bethlehem Ephrathah. This passage was ripped completely out of context so that the writer of Matthew could use it for his own purposes. But if we go back to Micah 5:6, we see that he was specifically talking about someone who would be a military leader, who would lay waste to the lands of Assyria and deliver Israel from invaders. Now, funny, when did Jesus do that again? Of course, there's no actual evidence, other than claims made by the writers of Matthew and Luke, that Jesus was ever born in Bethlehem to begin with. So we have no means to verify these claims and the supporting prophecies anyhow. It's all mythology, not demonstrable fact, and that's why skeptics are not at all impressed. But I can go on. How about the claim in Matthew 2:15, which says that Jesus will be called out of Egypt? This refers to Hosea 11:1, which reads, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Now, clearly, this is not intended to refer to Jesus, but to the nation of Israel and their captivity in Egypt. But Matthew, ever willing to misrepresent the Old Testament, takes half the passage and pretends it means something that it clearly does not. If you go back to Hosea in context, there's nothing remotely prophetic. In fact, every Bible guide I could find refers to this chapter as God's love for Israel. Nowhere is there evidence that it's making a prediction about anything. You want more? Okay, we can just leave Matthew for a moment and try one from John 19:37, which tries to find prophecy in Zechariah 12:10. And we find, surprise, surprise, that the author of John is misquoting Zechariah to get the effect he wants. Zechariah says, "And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced." And John says, well, they should look upon him who they pierced. Ripped out of context and selectively edited to mean something that it was never intended to mean. Because if we actually look at the context in Zechariah, he's writing about an invading army, not about a prophecy for Jesus. I could go on and on and on, but I think you've got the idea. This is how prophecies work in the Bible. Wishful thinking, ripped entirely out of context, used to reinforce empty claims. Why anybody would be impressed with any of this is beyond me. It's all blind faith, desperately fishing around for some reason to think that it's true. When you really sit down and look at the facts skeptically, it all falls apart. We can do the same thing with the Quran, looking at their supposed prophecies and watching them all disintegrate to critical thinking and skepticism. The same goes for every religion out there. They're all nonsense. There's nothing that can be rationally considered a prophecy that has demonstrably come true with any kind of specificity. I could just make up a character out of whole cloth, then cherry pick books and movies and TV series for supposed prophecies about events in said character's imaginary life that will prove anything about the character that I choose to assert. Do you buy into any of it? Should you? Of course not. So why do people buy into it when it comes to religion? Because religion isn't rational. It's emotional. It appeals to the weak-willed and weak-minded who are too pathetic to accept reality as it is. So they invent fantastical stories so that they feel good about themselves. They're just trying to rationalize why they believe what they already believe because it makes them feel good to believe it. But that's not how rational people operate. Rational people evaluate the evidence dispassionately. They look at it critically. They don't care where the evidence leads, so long as the evidence supports whatever conclusion it leads to. It doesn't matter how it makes you feel. It only matters if it's true. And when we look at religion, we find out that it isn't. The claims made about it are indefensible. And when it comes to prophecy, the failures are so utterly blatant that nobody in their right mind could help but see it. That says something about the religious, and it's nothing to be flattered about. I've had tons of debates with the religious about prophecy lately, and these people are delusional. They just are. They just spout this nonsense and expect you to buy into it hook, line, and sinker. When you actually take apart the claims and examine the components and find them laughably lacking, they get upset. I mean, they get really, really mad. Like, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to just blindly believe. But that's not reality. That's religious fantasy. Is it any wonder that these people are so messed up? It doesn't surprise me anymore. And it really shouldn't surprise you either.